In this module, we look, I provide, we'll just look at a basic overview of what you would expect in this course. Okay. Remember, this course is about that branch of linguistics that deals with what you might call meaning. Okay. Now, meaning is a very broad notion, and it's somewhat vague. Lots of, it can mean lots of different things. We will take a particular approach to the study of meaning by concentrating on certain specific kinds of problems having to do with meaning. There are lots of different aspects of meaning, okay, and it's impossible to survey all of those various approaches. The various approaches in the study of meaning come about because people often concentrate on different aspects of meaning. Okay. This is what we call semantics. Okay. So semantics is the study of meaning and the interpretation of natural language, and it can be studied from a wide variety of viewpoints. Okay. The particular approach to semantics that we take basically has two sources. One is the theory of generative grammar, which, at least in its contemporary form, derives from the work of Noam Chomsky, starting in the 1950s. And then there is also another source, and that is the philosophy of language and logic, which also, in its modern incarnation, you could date it back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, at first primarily a result of the investigations of philosophers and mathematicians like Bertrand Russell, Gottlob Frege, and then a variety of other. Then you have Tarski, who was also a logician, and a mathematician. None of these people were thinking about natural language per se, but were rather interested in something else. They were trying to give some kind of logical foundation for mathematics, and in that they were also looking at what logic and reasoning consists of. As it happens, they developed many tools that we will use in this course, and it's part of this of the particular approach to the study of meaning that we take. Okay, I should mention that both of these traditions have older roots. So, for example, generative grammar, in some sense, you can say goes back all the way to Panini, but in that case, in Panini's case, it wasn't formalized in the particular way that we look at. Plus, Panini was mostly looking at phonology and morphology, whereas we tend to concentrate on syntax and semantics, and whereas semantics has connections to the theory of syntax most directly. It has some connections to phonology as well, but it's a little more indirect. Okay. So now in this course, we assume, following the paradigm of generative grammar, that underlying language is a set of abstract structures, rule systems, and principles that govern such rule systems, and that they can be studied using the tools of mathematics and formal logic. So that's basically, we try to bring these two traditions in a particular way. Now, one of Chomsky's contributions, we concentrate on natural language, okay, but we adopt insights from the study of formal language and logic, many of which, in fact, were developed in order to, at one point, were developed to study either artificial systems like logical languages, or later in the 20th century, sometime in the mid-20th century, there were also certain mathematical tools that formed the basis of the study of artificial computer languages. Now, one of the insights of Chomsky's was to show that natural language can also be viewed in a somewhat similar way. Okay, there are significant differences between natural language and artificial language, no doubt about it. But nevertheless, Chomsky's insight was that you can still look at natural language as as a system that was a consequence of certain kinds of abstract rule systems and so on. Okay. A second assumption that is made in generative grammar is that the formal systems that underlie natural language are, in some sense, they form the mental makeup of the native speakers of a given language. So to just give one example, a native speaker of English, for example, knows that the following statement, "This is a cat," is a grammatical and meaningful sentence of their language, whereas the following combination of words, namely "is cat a this," is not a proper sentence. It's not a grammatical sentence. It's not something to which you would normally assign an interpretation, and so on. Okay. So this is the kind of knowledge that underlies a native speaker's knowledge of English. It's the same for other natural languages, and so on. Okay. A native speaker of English also implicitly knows, in some sense of the word know, that you can use the rules of English recursively to generate bigger structures that contain smaller units. So for example, suppose I say, "This is the cat that ate the rat." You start with the following sentence, you start with the sentence. You can add various things to get bigger structures. So you can say things like, "This is the cat that ate the rat that stole the cheese." Okay, you added some things to the previous sentence, and you got another grammatical sentence of English, and you could apply. There is a way. What you have done is you have taken a noun phrase and kept adding clauses to it. These are the structures that are called relative clauses. These are things that we assume you know from your study of at least some rudimentary knowledge of syntactic theory that you have. You know that you can keep doing this indefinitely. So you can say things like, "This is the cat that ate the rat that stole the cheese that the farmer made." You can further expand that by saying, "This is the cat that ate the rat that stole the cheese that the farmer made in the house that Jack built." And you can go on indefinitely. Okay. Now, in the generative paradigm, this is possible because the mind of the adult native speaker of English instantiate rules that construct noun phrases out of nouns, articles, and so on, and relative clauses. And furthermore, a relative clause can have a noun phrase inside it, which can again have a relative clause inside it, which can then again have a noun phrase that has a relative clause inside it, and so on indefinitely. Okay. A third idea that again is crucial to the study of generative grammar is that the study of language is seen as the study of mentally instantiated abstract structures that must be distinguished from the actual utterances that they produce or try to comprehend. The former is sometimes called competence, and the latter is called performance. In a sense, such a distinction is made in all the natural sciences. So, for example, In physics, what you aim at is the study of underlying laws that govern physical systems and cannot be reduced to the study of meter readings, let's say, right? So meter readings are things that you observe. In the domain of the study of natural language, the actual utterances are things that you actually observe, but the utterances in real time are the product of all kinds of things. Okay, they can be, they are a consequence of various different subsystems that interact in a particular way. If you want, one of the things that we do when we look at language from the standpoint of generative grammar is to abstract away from some of these other subsystems and concentrate on the abstract rules and the principles that underlie these abstract rules. Okay, so the most common experiment in theoretical linguistics is consulting native speakers, controlling for various factors that may interfere in the actual production of utterances of speakers in real time. Okay, so suppose I just want to give you an example. Suppose I say the following thing. Okay, this is an example that comes from the American comedian George Carlin. At one point he said, suppose I say, pick up that anchor and put it in my hip pocket. Okay, this is a sentence that's immediately recognized by a native speaker of English to be a grammatical sentence of English. Furthermore, it's also a meaningful statement. You know exactly what it means. However, it's also very unlikely to actually be produced in any real circumstance by a native speaker of English for various reasons, right? Because anchors are big things that you do not put in hip pockets and so on. There is no use for anyone to do something like this. And so if you actually look at a text of actual utterances of English, the probability that you would encounter a sentence like this is extremely low. Nevertheless, native speakers of English recognize this to be a grammatical sentence of English. And number two, they assign a particular interpretation to this sentence. And they know this in large part because they know that the recursive rules of language that govern the syntax of a natural language, and also and also the semantic knowledge, the meanings of individual words, and how the meanings of more complex expressions relate to the meanings of their component parts, basically leads you to understand what this utterance means immediately. In real time, your actual performance, namely your actual production, as well as comprehension, could also be influenced by lots of other things that do not have to do with these abstract rule systems that we talk about. So, for example, we are finite creatures with a finite memory. There are memory limitations. There are various constraints on how we process information. All of these things could interact with the abstract rule systems that we talk about in such a way as to concentrate the actual utterance to constrain the actual utterances that we make when we speak a natural language. Okay, so once we look at this, what we will do in this course is basically look at, we'll take something like this for granted, okay, and then we'll look at various aspects of meaning. We'll look at what a semantic theory looks like. We will take a look at what are the kinds of things that a semantic theory, what are the basic semantic relationships, for example, that a semantic theory must account for. What are the different kinds of constructions? What are the principles underlying the composition of meaning, namely the knowledge of how the meaning of a more complex expression relates to the meaning of its various component parts. What are the principles that underlie the computation of more complex meanings as from the meanings of the smaller units and their component parts? So we look at things like modals, we look at tense, various things that have to do with language, how a relative clause is interpreted, what a recursive semantic system looks like. We assume that you already have some background in syntactic theory, so you know what rules of syntax in a natural language, what kind of general form the rules of syntax in a natural language have. These are the kinds of things that we'll presuppose in this course, and we'll build on that prior knowledge that you already have and look at semantics. So the first thing that we might want to look at is the place of semantics in linguistic theory and its relationship to the other subfields of linguistics. So I'll briefly mention how the study of meaning relates to, for example, the study of syntax, how it relates to the study of the use of language that's sometimes called pragmatics, and so on. Okay? Semantics also indirectly relates to various other branches of linguistics, like it relates to neurolinguistics, which is the study of how the language is represented in the brain. It also relates to psycholinguistics, how we actually process, the study of how we actually process and acquire natural language in more realistic settings, and so on. So first of all, let me talk briefly about the relationship of semantic theory to syntactic theory. Okay. Now remember that in the generative tradition, the grammar of a language is the product of abstract rule systems and the principles governing such systems. Okay? Semantic theory is, in a sense, parasitic on the result of whatever is generated by the syntactic component of the language. Okay? So you see that semantics, at least the aspects of meaning that we look at in this course, in some sense builds on what you know from syntax already. Okay? And to see the point, you will notice that meaning in general, or meaning of utterances, is in a fundamental sense structure dependent, right? So look at the following example. Suppose I said, I saw the man with the telescope. Okay? Now, from your knowledge of syntactic theory, you would know that this sentence is structurally ambiguous. Okay? So it's possible for this sentence to have two different structures. One is a structure where the man is the object, is the direct object of the verb see, and with the telescope is a prepositional phrase that modifies saw the man. Okay? But this sentence also has a different structure, one where the man with the telescope is one noun phrase that contains an article, a common noun, and a relative clause. The man with the telescope is one unit, and this entire unit happens to be the direct object of the verb see. Okay? So there are two structures. One where see has one direct object and a prepositional phrase modifier, another one where see has one direct object, and the man with the telescope, the prepositional phrase that you appear is modifying the man rather than the verb see. Okay? corresponding to these two different syntactic structures, you have two different meanings of the sentence. The one where the prepositional phrase modifies the verb has an interpretation basically that the speaker used a telescope to see a certain man that has previously been mentioned in the discourse in some way. It could also mean the other sense of the sentence, where the man with the telescope is the direct object of the verb see. We are talking about a man who has a telescope in some way, and the speaker saw that person. Okay. Now, you can also see you can see the structure dependence of meaning by looking at sentences involving all kinds of expressions. So there is a class of expressions in natural language called pronouns, and these are expressions like he, she, it, himself, herself, etc. The first three, he, she, and it, are examples of what in syntactic theory are called binding theory or BT pronouns. The other ones are called binding theory anaphors or BT anaphors. Okay. For now, don't worry about where the terminology comes from. You may have seen this in your syntax courses at some point. But the point is, there are various structural conditions on how you interpreted these things, how you interpret these things. So there is a semantic component to the way we understand these expressions. But there are also the interpretation that you get is also dependent on the syntax of these expressions. So roughly all of these pronouns, he, she, it, the BT pronouns, as well as BT anaphors, are expressions that don't have a meaning by themselves, but they refer to things. But their reference depends on the context in a very fundamental way. They get their semantic value, so to speak, from something else in the discourse. That something else in the discourse could be something that's understood to be present in your utterance context, or it could be the value of something else that's present in a sentence, it appears somewhere in a sentence, and so on. Okay. Now, BT pronouns have to get their reference from something in the context. BT anaphors, on the other hand, are linguistic expressions, they're pronominal expressions that have to get their value from from the linguistic context. Okay? So suppose I use a word like himself or herself. I can say something. You can say the following sentence: he left. Okay, even though the referent of he is not necessarily mentioned in either this sentence or in any previous sentence, as long as you can infer who you are referring to when you use the expression he by some kind of contextual information. So suppose I am in a class and a male student gets up and leaves. I could simply say he left, and everyone understands that I am referring to that person. Okay? Or I could point to someone and say she is going to leave, and my pointing allows you to infer who I am referring to when I use the word she. Okay? The word himself, on the other hand, has a different characteristic. The sentence himself left is simply an ungrammatical sentence of English. Himself is a BT anaphor. Its reference has to be the semantic value of something that has appeared in the sentence. Now, this is what makes himself different from he. Now, However, the interpretation of, so even though there is a semantic difference in some way between pronouns like he and reflexives like himself, there are also structural constraints there are structural syntactic constraints on what himself and herself can refer to. So compare the following two sentences. Suppose I say John saw himself. That's a good sentence of English. It's also a sentence where himself not only can refer to John, but in fact must refer to John. But now compare this with John saw him. Okay? Him cannot be taken to refer to John. It must refer, in order for this sentence to be grammatical, him must refer to some other person whose existence you infer from the context, but it cannot refer to John. Okay? Now, you can put reflexives and pronouns in bigger sentences. So now compare the previous pair, John saw himself and John saw him, with the following pair. John thinks Bill saw him, and compare this to John thinks Bill saw himself. In the first sentence, John thinks Bill saw him. Him can refer to John. Him doesn't have to refer to John. It could refer to some person, but him cannot refer to Bill. Him can refer to John. Him cannot refer to Bill, but him can also refer to some third person. Now compare this with John thinks Bill saw himself. In a sentence like this, himself cannot refer to John. It must refer to Bill. It cannot refer to either John or a third person. Okay? In other words, even though we understand what expressions like him and, so in other words, words like him and himself are in some sense pronouns. Their interpretation crucially depends on certain aspects of the syntax of the utterances that they are embedded in. Okay, so this is one kind of example where the interpretation of complex expressions depends on the structure of the sentences or utterances that you make in a natural language like English. Semantic theory also relates to what's called pragmatics. So for example, pragmatics is the study of the use of language in particular contexts. Okay. Now, while some philosophers and linguists have denied that there is a meaningful principal distinction between the two subfields, it is nevertheless useful to distinguish, for example, what is said in a conversation from what is conveyed. Okay, so there's much of what I'm going to say derives from the work of the philosopher Grice, who showed that it is extremely useful to make a distinction between what is said and what is conveyed. One of the things Grice pointed out was that there are certain kinds of inferences that he called implicatures that arise, that are over and above and in some sense distinct from the literal meanings of sentences. Okay. However, one of the things Grice argued was that these inferences crucially depend on the literal meanings of what we say, plus certain other principles that are not, strictly speaking, part of semantic theory. So this is one way of seeing how semantic theory relates to what's called pragmatic theory. So one example that he gave is, imagine a conversation that goes as follows. Suppose someone says, "Did you enjoy your dinner last night?" And someone else responds by saying, "Well, I had meat and potatoes." B does not directly answer the question, but if A knows that B likes meat and potatoes, it would be perfectly normal for them to infer that B, in fact, intends to convey that they enjoyed the dinner last night. These are the kinds of things that you study when you study the actual use of statements or utterances in a natural language setting. And again, one of the things that you try to, there are ways in which the theory of semantics relates to the theory of syntax. I should also point out, there are similar connections between the theory of semantics and neurolinguistics, psycholinguistics, and all the other branches of linguistics, and we will briefly look at some of these things at some point.